doing this. I've known Mary Skelton Roberts for a long time, and I'm very happy that she's agreed to join us today because I know you're going to find her both a compelling speaker and a really interesting transit-oriented professional. She's currently serving as the representative of the city of Boston, my hometown, on the MBTA board. And when our mayor, Michelle Wu, made this appointment, I can tell you it was greeted with applause by transit advocates all across the Metro Boston region, because we've come to know Mary over the years as a really strong, principled ally and supporter of public transportation, sustainable mobility. And she's had an impact that we can also talk about. I want to say Mary is an MIT alum, got her MCP at the Department of Urban Studies and Planning here. And she has had a career working extensively with nonprofits and philanthropies in the climate and energy spaces, including leading the climate initiative for the Barr Foundation, which really was critical in advancing many of the forward-looking policies that are now in place in the city of Boston and in the Boston region, particularly in connection with improving the visibility, the perception, and the reality of bus transit. At the Energy Foundation, after the Barr Foundation, Mary led a national team that secured the Climate and Equitable Jobs Act in Illinois and galvanized clean car goals across the country. She also led a team that provided some important expertise to the Biden administration as it was moving forward to advance its bipartisan infrastructure bill. She serves on the boards of Point 32 Health Foundation, the Massachusetts Governor's Latino Economic Empowerment Council, the Latino Equity Fund at the Boston Foundation, and on the Boston Boys and Girls Clubs. She has made a great impact in Metro Boston and continues to do so now in this new role as a MBTA board member. She's an extraordinary leader, an effective leader for the cause of equitable mobility. And I'm delighted, Mary, to hand the floor over to you today.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. And I'll start by saying so much of what Jim described and many of the wins we've had, not just in Boston, but throughout the Commonwealth, we could never have achieved it without the kind of partnership that Jim Aloisi and many other folks in city and municipal government and state government and the advocacy community helped achieve. So I'm going to focus a lot of my discussion today on this nexus between transportation, land use, and equity, and really focusing on the role, not just that philanthropy can play, but what is it that we need to get communities more engaged in wanting the kind of public transit systems that we're seeing all over the world. Before that, it is a little bit important to understand a little bit of historical context on public education. I'm going to assume that you know a lot of this, so I'm going to go pretty quickly. But basically, public transportation has really followed the pre-industrial era when people were making things with their hands. And when they were making things with their hands, people got around either walking, that we didn't have the technology we have today. So they got around by walking, or they got around primarily by horses draven by carriages, by wagons driven by horse or pulled by wagons. We then transitioned to the streetcar, the cable car, and it wasn't until the Industrial Revolution that we started to see sort of the spurring of mass transit, where we started to see cable cars replaced the wagon and replaced primarily the horses. And since those moments, we have always had this tension about who owns the street and what mode of transportation makes sense to use the street. And then in the 20th century, we really saw sort of with the electric engine, and then we got the gas-powered vehicle. And what we started to see was public transit became more accessible. But our original transit system was very small, and it was designed to carry wealthy and elite families. So that's important to keep in mind, that the public transit system was never designed for the middle income and lower income. And that's been reflected till this day in terms of how we fund the system, who pays for it, and also the vision that we have for transportation. Three things that we really need to be thinking about in terms of a changing landscape as we're thinking about this future. Technology really does influence how we're moving around, what we're measuring, and also the kinds of mobility systems that we're looking at. I mentioned earlier, we started with, wagons being pulled by horses, to trains that were running on, electricity, to gas-powered both trains and buses. And then we're now in the moment of, autonomous vehicles. So the technology and the innovation really does drive technology, but more importantly, how people get around. One of the things that there's a tension now between is how much of public transit do we want to continue to push, and we need to, for both access and congestion, climate and equity purposes. And yet we're seeing this really big push that people still love and want to be in their automobiles. So how we design the policy, how we design public transit, how we get people engaged and interested is really going to determine the kind of future that we have. And it doesn't happen without really good collaboration and innovation. We also need to be thinking about urban design. When we look at transportation, I don't need to tell you that transportation is a means to an end. We don't get on a bus, we don't drive a car because that's the experience. We drive or we ride a bus or we walk or we take public transit because we are trying to get somewhere. So really thinking about the built environment and the connection of our urban landscape to public transit is a must if we're going to do this well and get people to travel in modes that are low carbon and really good for the public, good for equity, good for our communities. The other thing that's critically important is we really need to have good governance without thinking about what's the vision for transportation, what's our vision for our communities, what's the vision that we want to have for the common good or for the commons. We end up getting sort of really disconnected transit modes, transit systems. We have communities that are rejecting many of the policies that we're trying to move in place. So governance is critical to this. And we need collaboration and governance at the local level, at the regional level, at the state and federal level. Without that, we continue to have some of the disjointed public transit systems and choices that we're seeing today. I want to spend a little bit of time talking about equity, because I think when we talk about equity, we say it, but we often don't explain what we mean by that. And so, in Greater Boston, when we were doing the work with Go Boston 2030 and other communities, we really started to ask, some neighborhoods closer to downtown have transportation and low housing costs, while other neighborhoods with more affordable rents have high transportation costs. If we're talking about equity, we're looking at both of these equations. How do we make the transit affordable and accessible to communities, regardless of whether you live in Greater Boston or outside of the Boston region? And then how are you thinking about housing so that people can afford to live in different places throughout the region and throughout the Commonwealth? And that we're really thinking about those two things in tandem. If you look at this map, what this begins to show is that, the darker blended color indicates higher combined cost burdens. So you see places like West Roxbury, you see places, inside of the Boston that you have high rents and high housing costs, and you also have sort of not easy or low cost transportation options. And that is a problem in a city like Boston, where 80% of the economy flows in and out of the city. You need to have good transportation options and access, and you also need to have housing that people can afford to live in. So those are the conundrums that we sort of look at. And when we look at equity, we try to address both of those. When we look at economic opportunity, and some of these maps were created years ago by Nelson Nygaard, but they really wanted us to look at residents outside of a 5 to 10 minute walk sheds along transit corridors. So when we are looking at equity, we also ask, how far are people? Are people within a 5 and 10 minute walk to transit? And that could be walking. Sometimes are they near, can they walk to a transit station? Can they take a bike or a blue bike to where they need to go? And just making sure that we really are connecting people to those job corridors. They're downtown, they're the medical area, they're the Seaport District, they're sort of where our universities are, and really thinking about economic opportunity and how we're getting people to those places. The other thing that's incredibly important, not just in Massachusetts, but throughout the country, is how are we thinking about transit responsiveness and how are we thinking about climate change? I'm sorry, climate responsiveness. What we're seeing is we're getting, the 100-year storm is now happening maybe every other year. And so we really need to be thinking about how is our transit system more resilient? How are we building redundancy into the system? And as we're looking at these storm surges, how are we adapting quickly and then responding quickly? If you look at this map, 432 miles of roadway are vulnerable to a changing climate, and most of that is storm surges. We've all seen the images of our transit system flooding a few years back. This summer, New York's transit system flooded. They're flooding all over the country. We saw the pictures of, Asia, that there were massive, massive floods. And so we really need to be thinking about the impact of climate change on both transportation and housing and where people live. So when we're thinking about transit and how to look at transportation system, there are so many lessons around the world, and I'm going to go broad and then go a little bit deeper. But across the world, people are saying we need to be thinking about multimodal integration. So really thinking about transit systems that feature good integration, allowing seamless transitions. One example that I've seen is I went to Medellin, Colombia, and you see that they have a bus rapid transit system. It comes right into the train station. It is one station. From there, people take either an escalator or an elevator, and they are on the train platform. They also have cable cars so that you can actually go further up for workers that live up in the mountain area, and then they can come down. There's a bike share that is free, so you can take the bike share, you can come by bus, and it's all integrated. And when you are in the station, there's amenities, there's coffee shops and places that you can shop. So what they're really trying to do is ensure that no matter what your mode is, that you can transition from one mode to the next and that the system is integrated. For me, that is sort of best in class of how you think about moving people around, because it's seamless, it's quick to get to, and it's an experience that people can appreciate and enjoy. The other lesson that we're seeing around the world is that people are looking at bus rapid transit, or not even looking. We are late in the United States in integrating bus rapid transit. When you look at places like Mexico City, and you look at, all over Brazil, and you look at places in South Africa, Jakarta, I can go on and on, even here in Hartford, Connecticut, and in Cleveland. What you're seeing is the experimentation and the adoption, rapid implementation of bus rapid transit. It's taken hold across the world because you can build it faster, you can still have infrastructure, it's more flexible than fixed rail, and you can build it at a fraction of the cost. Why we are not adopting that more rapidly in the United States is something that just baffles me. The other thing that we're seeing really emerge across the world, and I'll show you some images in a few minutes, is robust rail networks. Cities like Tokyo, London, Singapore, Seoul, they are expanding their rail networks to get people in and out of cities, but to create more opportunities for people to live in suburban areas where the housing costs are less. And so they are thinking about how do you use rail, not just to create stronger economies in cities, but also to be thinking about sort of suburban areas, bedroom communities, other places where the housing costs are significantly cheaper, and you can bring people in and out as needed. And then again, I talked about sort of thinking about the urban environment, but pedestrian-oriented design, again, thinking about street calming, thinking about increasing safety. In Massachusetts and in Boston, we had Vision Zero, which really was aimed at reducing the amount of fatalities. But all of these things create what we really talk about is really good multimodal, seamless connection between transportation, pedestrian-oriented development and transit-oriented development, really thinking about them in tandem. So I want to give you some examples of some of the really great sort of public transit and connections. This is in Madrid, Spain. And what you see are a couple of things. The metro is really easily illuminated. People can find it. It's not hidden. You know where it is. You see that there's a bike there. There's motorcycles. There's really good pedestrian walkways so people can walk through the city. And it's pretty robust. You see there's businesses down on that first floor of the buildings, and you see there's housing above it. So again, looking at opportunities to really have communities that provide a number of resources where the roads are shared, and particularly where you have really big, dense sidewalks where people can walk and have access. This picture here, I believe this might be Seoul, where again, you have a really extensive built-out bus network where people can move freely, where the buses offer the kind of flexibility that rails do not have. And what the buses offer here is, you can't really see the inside of this bus, but it's a luxury bus, so that they've removed a lot of the stigma that we have here in the United States associated with buses. This is a picture of Singapore. Again, really robust transportation network. You see lots of open and green space. You see a pretty robust commuter network designed to get people in and out of the city. If you look at on the ground, you see both buses that are pretty active, and you see sort of, people using vehicles and motorcycles. But again, really thinking about how you're moving people in and out of different places so that you are creating a regional economy, not just an individual city economy, and even more importantly, providing people with lots of transit options. This is again Berlin. And what I particularly like about this image is that Berlin has made the conscious decision to prioritize, in this case, surface rail, but they have the median lane, which means that the cars each of them have a lane on each side, but the priority here is public transit. This has been a deliberate policy decision to prioritize public transit. And when you do it, you use median lanes and you really prioritize that experience for people. It's another picture. I believe this might be also, might be Berlin as well. So in Massachusetts, the other thing we're looking at across the country is not just how are we moving people around, but oftentimes when we talk about transportation, we talk about the last mile dilemma. How do you get people where they need to go? A bus will go a certain place, a train will go to a certain stop, and then how are you moving people around? Well, all over the United States, we're really experimenting with on-demand, which offers an opportunity for people to use their mobile phones, and they get to where they need to go that last mile. Seattle is experimenting with it. Los Angeles is doing it. New York, Washington, D.C. But there's a recognition that if we're going to make public transit as competitive as we have sort of getting in your car and getting where you need to go, we also have to deal with the last mile or the last half mile. And so this is sort of new innovation that's being experimented all over the United States. Here in Massachusetts, in our little town, Newton, Massachusetts, for those of you that know it, we have a system called Numo. It's all app-based, and you pretty much enter your destination. It'll give you a short walk, which is usually less than 10 minutes. And the rideshare will pick you up, and usually there may be 2 or 3 people. It's very, very inexpensive. I think it might be $2 or $2.50. So it's a ride that gets you wherever you need to go. It's within sort of the Newton city limits, but again, it's an adjunct to the public transit system there. So when, in my work in philanthropy, one of the things we try to do is really say, how do we help municipal governments and city governments and state governments do better work with engaging residents and engaging communities, and do the work that's required to really have these long-term comprehensive plans that are robust in engagement, and more importantly, set the stage for the next 15 to 20 years of public transit. So we think about a few considerations when we really want to increase engagement. Number one is we cut through the noise. There's a lot of rhetoric around how many units of housing do we want to build? What's going to be the impact on public transit? Is it going to displace people? Is it going to provide more access to opportunity? And typically what foundations are able to do is support the kind of research that says, where is the data? What is the data telling us? What are we learning from the data? And how do we make sense from fact from fiction? It's a really important role, and foundations and philanthropy can be really good partners in municipal government in doing that. The other consideration, it's really important, is meet communities where they are. Some communities are what we call early adopters. We say, we want to try, a bus rapid transit pilot. And they're like, we're in. And other communities are like, absolutely not. We don't want it anywhere. And so part of our philosophy is work with the early adopters, show what's possible. And then those other communities that want to do it and are engaged, most of them will follow suit. The other thing for us, it's a really important rule as we're thinking about how to leverage philanthropic dollars, is keep it interesting. The work of transportation, it's not the most interesting thing in the world. I love it. I'm an MIT geek. I love this stuff. But truthfully, if you're working with communities and you're working with residents, they may not need to know what a walk shed is, but what they do need to know is I need to be 5 minutes from my transit stop, or I need to be 5 minutes from my my bus route or my bike share. So we found many, many ways of keeping it interesting. I'll give you an example in a couple minutes. We also think it's really important to deliver on promises early. Tell people what's possible, show them what's possible, and then give them an example so that they can experience it and speak from experience. And the other thing we often do is we help municipalities, we help our partners remember that it's a long game. Building transportation, building houses, building communities, we're talking 10, 15 years at minimum. And so you have to have resiliency, you have to keep those plans moving forward, and you have to remember not to let the smallest obstacle prevent you from getting the work done, because it does take time. So I'm going to give you an example of an initiative that I worked on, and it was such a wonderful partnership, and I'm so proud of this work, and the city of Boston did an amazing job. So I believe it was in 2015, Boston wanted to do a long-term transportation plan, and they wanted to do the Go Boston 2030 plan. And the Bar Foundation at the time where I was, we partnered with them to get this done. And we really wanted to do a couple of things really, really well. Number one, we wanted to bring City Hall out of City Hall and into the communities of Boston. And number two, we wanted the plan to be informed by the realities that the neighborhoods were living on the ground. And so our job was to really partner with the city to do that. And so the city put together a 2-phase plan that one was visioning, really starting with a question campaign, asking people in all the neighborhoods of Boston, what is your vision for transportation? What would you like it to look like? And if you had a magic wand or you could do anything, what would that look like? We then did visioning labs where we took those ideas and brought people together to get their feedback, but then also begin to prioritize some of those ideas that they gave us. That resulted in a report that set goals and targets. And from there, the city went on to do action planning. So project and policies ideas, they evaluated those ideas. They brought in Nelson Nygaard and other professional transportation planners. So they took what were initially great ideas from communities, moved them into the visioning process, then mapped them out into projects and policies, evaluated them, and then came up with a report. One of the things that we were able to do as the foundation is, again, remember, one of my considerations was make it interesting. So this is one of the campaigns. So what if you never had to wait for a public bus again? What's your question? We wanted people to engage in the conversation of public transit in a very, very different way. I remember this, we had a huge snowstorm in February and it was freezing, and we still got this truck to go to every neighborhood. It did 15 stops in the middle of February. It went into every neighborhood. We served hot chocolate. We kept people warm. And because it was interesting, it was so cold outside, the truck had heat, and we just had streams of people coming in, and we were able to, again, engage them and ask them questions. But again, this was a different way of the city of Boston doing its planning and engaging residents. We collected a total of 5,000 questions. It was at the time the largest public engagement process the city of Boston had ever done. We also then had I shouldn't say we, the city of Boston. I say we because it was such a good partnership, but this was really their work. The city of Boston then had a whole mobile campaign where you could get on your phone and you could answer any of your questions. Tell us about yourself, describe your idea, map your idea. We then had a one-day public outreach session where we asked people to then prioritize these ideas that they'd given us. There were street fairs and outreach. You can see, I think there was a Red Sox game one day, and we said, okay, we're going to grab some folks that are going to the game. We really found very different ways and different places throughout the city to engage people. This was more of when we did our community processes. We brought in community facilitators to go into all the neighborhoods. We worked with the community centers throughout Boston. And again, we had communities give us feedback, residents give us feedback. Ended up getting 3,700, I believe, different ideas. They were related to walking, biking, transit, driving. And from there, you could see that there were different policies. So there were projects only, policies only that needed to be adopted to implement the ideas. And then you had ideas coded. This was all done by the transportation planners. So again, you took these ideas, and once they got in-house to the transportation planners, they developed scenarios, which then became the action plan. From there, the city of Boston put together what was its vision. So every plan needs a vision, and they envisioned a city in a region where all residents have better and more equitable travel choices, efficient transportation networks that foster economic opportunity, and take steps to prepare for climate change. So they were very clear. What is it that we're trying to do? We want all the residents to be able to move around more equitably. We want transportation networks that are efficient. Remember, I mentioned the Medellin, Colombia example. That's efficient transportation. And they wanted residents to prepare for climate change. They identified three primary goals: access, safety, and they wanted to make sure that in the process that these goals were really clear, and then they came up with mode shift goals. So equity, economic opportunity, and climate responsiveness. Here were the goals. And then these are the visions that I articulated. They came up with metrics so that they could measure what they were trying to do. So Boston commuter public transit, that 33% mode that in 2015, 33% of all riders use public transit. They wanted that up by the third. They right in Boston at the time, 1.9% were biking. They wanted to increase that fourfold. So these were some of the indicators. COVID had a lot to do with impacting how much of that they were able to accomplish, but it was phenomenal for them to set goals. They also had a vision zero. So remember, we talked about good urban design and walkable streets. And so they put together a vision zero plan and traffic and vehicle related fatalities. And so the other thing that we were able to do at the foundation, we brought in a series of advocates and community leaders and transportation planners throughout the world. And we asked the question, is there a mode of transportation that makes sense for Greater Boston that Boston hasn't been able to implement? And time again, the folks came back and said, why isn't Boston and Massachusetts doing bus rapid transit? And I remember at the time, I was asking quite a few of the transportation advocates and the transportation professionals, and they kept saying, you can't build it in Boston. The roads don't lend themselves. You can't do it because the roads are too narrow, and it's just nearly impossible. And, one of the good things about, I guess, maybe being an MIT person is you always ask good questions. And I'm like, well, what's preventing it? The roads are too narrow. And then you say, well, the roads are narrow in some places in, Mexico City, and they still have bus rapid transit. Or you're saying, well, look at Jakarta. They're building bus rapid transit and they have some funky roads there too. So that quite didn't make sense. And then I kept hearing, well, it's too expensive. And when you start talking to the transportation planners, you hear, well, bus rapid transit is probably about a third less expensive than it is building fixed rail. So that didn't match. So we went out and we put out an RFP, and we asked some of the international bus rapid transit organizations, help us think through this. And so we had a partnership with the Institute for Transportation Development Policy, and we asked two questions. Funding aside and politics aside, can you actually build bus rapid transit in Greater Boston? Can you build it? Like physically, can you get it on the ground? And this was the beginning of the Bus Rapid Transit Report. This report was a collaborative process that had many, many partners, including the city of Boston, every advocacy group, at the time, Walk Boston, which is now Walk Massachusetts, A Better City was engaged, Northeastern University was engaged. We really brought in a multi-stakeholder group to help us think through these questions. And so our goal was to advance BRT in improving public transit. We wanted to socialize the idea, and we wanted to have bus rapid transit be part of the transportation vernacular here in Massachusetts. We wanted to present feasible corridors. If you can actually build it, we wanted to know where could we actually put this thing? So that was part of the goal. And then we wanted to ensure the policymakers and residents were fully aware of what bus rapid transit was. We realized pretty early on that what we had was the Silver Line, and people thought that was bus rapid transit, but it really wasn't the example that we were seeing across the world. In places across the world where you have gold standard bus rapid transit, it has clear characteristics, and people didn't even know the distinction. So one was to, create conversation, have people understand what bus rapid transit was, and then if you could build it, identify where we could build it here. The other thing that we thought was incredibly important was to give it a sort of a marketing or a public persona. And so we went all over the world and pretty much all over the country. We said places that are doing really innovative, whether it's transportation or arts and culture, what is the one thing they're doing? They are doing really good sort of marketing and campaign. So we hired a campaign company called Ad Hoc to help us really think about how do we start like giving bus rapid transit a brand new look and a new face so that when people see it, they kind of understand what it looks like. And these are some examples of what people were doing across the world. So you see the opera had one that had sort of this sort of branding. Paris, New York had a interesting, their ballet had one. And then we went to Midtown Atlanta, and what we saw was that different transit agencies were also doing some interesting branding around their modes. Paris, I think this was Midtown Atlanta. And so we did the same thing with bus rapid transit. We worked with Ad Hoc Communications and Denterline to really help us, came up with a color palette. We identified several municipalities that wanted to partner with us. I mentioned earlier, we picked some early adopters. So Boston had these primary colors, Cambridge had this set of colors, Everett had their set, and Arlington. Everything that we did for bus rapid transit in these 4 cities had their specific color palettes. We did some modeling and some pilots. Everett did quite a bit of pilots to give people an example of, for example, what some of the elements of bus rapid transit would look like. And one of the things we did, this was an example of the School Street bus stop in Everett, Massachusetts. We were testing 2 different things. We were testing level boarding. If you look at the red line there, we were able to procure a boarding platform, and I think it came all the way from Spain or something, but we brought it internationally, and we wanted people to really experience what it would feel like to do level boarding. So be able to get on the bus without having to step onto a platform, without having to sort of have the bus put its the gap that you typically see. And we also wanted people to have a wonderful experience of what it could look like to be on a bus stop. So, our marketing company Ad Hoc did what they called a flower bomb. They decorated this entire bus stop with flowers. It was all over the news. People came and took pictures. People came and rode the bus stop, but it was designed to do a couple of things: bring attention to the bus stop, show that when you really did a bus stop with creative elements that people would come, and more importantly, have people understand that bus stops could be a dignified experience. So Everett did lots of work, and you remember I showed you the branding. Everett did lots of work with the bus stop and really engaging BRT. But In Boston, so fast forward to 2024, and Boston just announced that they are going to be building its Blue Hill Avenue bus rapid transit corridor. So it's center median, it has covered platforms, it's easily accessible. And here is an example of what you can accomplish when you're working collaboratively, when you've given people an idea of what's possible, when you have really good technical analysis, and more importantly, long after we were done, partnering with Boston, they spent the next 5 to 7 years in these communities, having community meetings, talking to residents, getting residents to understand and engage in what it could look like, how it could help the economic sort of vitality of the community. And just, I think it was several months ago, they announced that they were going to actually move forward with this corridor. So again, how do you really think about getting municipalities to support more public transit? So I'm going to end there. I have no idea if I went over my time or not, but I'd love to take questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Mary. This was incredible. Like, you completely zoomed out. You gave a global perspective, and then you zoomed right back into Boston, and then actually like different neighborhoods, and very, very impressive. Just the breadth of your talk and your knowledge on this in this regard. So one question that we'll do questions very quickly because we're a bit short on time. But what I was wondering is that you were touching upon the resilient rail network in Asia. And I was wondering how or what are the main inhibitors in the US for railway network investment and expansion?
So I think a couple of things. One is that the model for transportation has never really been viable. It relies on federal funding. Federal funding pays primarily for capital investments, which is, the trains and to put the tracks on the road, but it doesn't pay for operating costs. And so what you're seeing in Asia and even Latin America is a really different funding model, and that involves government subsidizing a large percentage of it, and then different funding mechanisms. There's land value capture. So you're able to tax the land and use some of that revenue to fund public transit. There are also private and public partnerships where the private sector pays for some of the public transportation. Like, there's one example here where MIT, it could be so simple as MIT does a great job of this. Every student gets a transit pass. There's an investment that the institute, I'm so proud that it's my institute, but there's an investment that MIT has made in public transit. We have some of the largest hospitals, universities, businesses. If all of them decided to get transit for their employees, that would help pay for the public, or offset some of the costs. If municipalities were able to provide more revenue to the transit system, that would help offset the cost. So I think that there's more models for transit that we haven't, for funding transit, that we haven't explored here. I know you had Rich Davey before me. I hope he talked about what New York is doing, everything from revenue to value capture to maybe taxing, different models. And I think we should be experimenting more in Massachusetts. Massachusetts just put together a transportation funding commission that's exploring that. And I think it's a great thing.
Yeah. I think we really need more congestion pricing and also enforcement of bike and bus lane priority.
Congestion pricing is one that's been a big one that's been proposed from Massachusetts.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love to see it while I'm still here. So that would be surely a great win for the transit community.
Yeah. Also, if you care about climate change, you have to acknowledge that about 70% of the emissions come from people traveling into Boston from the other parts of the Commonwealth. So congestion pricing is something that can be done. It's done in London and other places across the world.
Yeah, coming from Europe, I see a lot of ideas that you have shared. I grew up with them, so it is somewhat alienating for me to not find them again here. But I think we're on a good path. I think the last question is from Steve Still. It's an audience question, And he asks, what are the obstacles to getting priority transit in street medians? Like, what are the main obstacles there?
I'm sorry, ask me the question again.
The main obstacles of getting priority transit in street medians, like in the center of the roads, that you touched upon.
The main obstacle, if we're being fully transparent, is that the car industry has a huge lobby and drivers have an outsized influence in terms of how our roads are used. When we look at public transit, it doesn't have the kind of sort of lobbying effort and the kind of political push that's needed to really have center median transit. I think it's a political issue, and I also think it's who has like the money.
Yeah, that resonates well with what we've seen in the past.
Yeah.
But let's hope it's gonna change at some point.
Well,
Yeah.
I think it has to change when you look at the congestion and you look at the inequity and you look at climate change. If you care about those things, then it has to change. You have to continue to advocate and push for more public transit, and you have to prioritize the roads so that public transit is people's primary mode of traveling. And you have to make it easy and convenient and dignified and accessible for people.
Yeah, those are all keywords that I think we will talk again next year and the year after that, and yeah, for a while. But yeah, with that, I think we're gonna close this keynote by you. It was really, really, really incredible to see this breadth of knowledge and in one spot, and just have it transpire a bit over the screen. We will love you to see you again on MIT campus at your home university and your home institution. And with that, I wish you a great rest of the day. And thank you so much again.
It was wonderful being here. Take care. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye. With that, we will take 1-2 minutes of a short break, and then we'll dive right into the future of urban bus.